Hey, how are you? I hope you're well. This is video number 3 in a series of these videos. For those who don't know, if you haven't seen my first two, my name is Mark Tiffany. I am a fitness coach, owner of dcsfit.com and Dynamic Core Studios fitness facility in Clydebank to the west of Glasgow, in Scotland, if you don't know where that is. And in the last video I talked about the effect of lockdowns on the fitness industry and the hospitality sector. Now, I could probably go into that in an awful lot more detail. I'm trying to keep these relatively short, about 10 minutes or so. If I go over, I go over, but such is life. I have a tendency to be able to talk about this subject for hours on end, and I've tried to keep my mouth zipped for most of it, because I don't want to be controversial for the sake of being controversial. But again, as I mentioned at the end of the last video, the point of this is to try and get some level of sensible discussion going, if possible. It is not here to preach. It is not here to say I'm right and you're wrong. I'm perfectly aware of the fact, as a human being, I am likely to have a level of my own bubble, my own how things affect me, and confirmation bias as well, to some degree. Now, I've tried to keep that out of my research, but I can't deny that it's likely to be there. That's also true of the subject of this video, politicians. Now, politicians are human beings like the rest of us. You may not agree, but it's true. They were born, they were children, they had no bias whatsoever in them when they were born, and their lives, like all of us, have been coloured by their surroundings, by the people that they've been influenced by their upbringing, by the circumstances that have been thrust upon them. And that's just how it is. Now, people who end up in the political sphere, quite often, particularly in the UK, for the people in Westminster, Eton's a big thing. You know, like you end up in the same schooling system. You're kind of brought up almost to be a politician. For a lot of them, not all, but you know, for the ones that we sort of, the way that we think about politicians, that seems to be the route. It's the old boys club, and you know, everybody knows each other from an early age, and you're sort of groomed into politics. Less so in Scotland. I think there's still some of that in Scotland, where you are kind of like, your career path is laid out for you, even if it's your decision from a very early age. But it's not something you generally just drop into in your mid-30s or 40s or something. You just decide to become a politician. Some people have, but it's not the case. So my point is, they are human beings. Whether you believe it or not, they are human beings. And the point of that being that their beliefs are going to be shaped and coloured. Now, I'm going to try and talk a little bit more about Scotland here because it's where I'm based, but I'll obviously mention the UK government and maybe some global situations there too. But in Scotland, you have the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, out giving speeches constantly. It was daily briefings for an awful long time, but they're coming out frequently. Whenever there's something to be said, she's out there. And what I will say is, at the beginning of her part in this whole scenario, I think her delivery was incredibly good, much better than we were getting from Westminster. She was clear, people knew what was going on, and because of the clarity, I think there was a little bit more in the way of adherence to it, because we could see where she was coming from, and it was understandable what the message was, why it was there, and what she was trying to do. I, to a large extent, haven't really agreed with much of the decision making all along, and the reason being that from day one of this thing, it became something that I became interested in. But when I get interested in something, I don't just sort of listen to the news or read Facebook or something like that. I start going to look for statistics and experts. And there are many, many epidemiologists in the world who have no affiliation with any government, who are saying things that are completely to the contrary of the information that is coming out through the health experts within the government. Now, this is something I have spoken to the Scottish Government about via emails and letters and things like that, and I've had responses, local MSPs, those kind of things. I've tried to have these discussions as best I possibly can, but I've continued to do the research. What I've been told by them is that they try to take out a broad range and go with the consensus globally. I don't think that's particularly true. I think the thing is they have a broad range of global advisors who are advisors to other governments around the world, and then they start to try and take a consensus. Now, a lot of the stats that came out of the start of this pandemic were to do with the overwhelm of the NHS, how many cases there were going to be. There were going to be millions of people swarming the NHS system. And most of this came from Neil Ferguson, who was an advisor to the UK government. And actually, it was his statistics and his model that was used to a large extent globally. So when people were saying, "Oh, this is going to be huge," they were basing it on his model of extrapolation. Now, from what I can gather, again, not an expert, this is what I'm trying to work out for myself, is that he was taking what was happening in the small level of containment that had happened so far and extrapolating that out to the whole country. But at that point, we were talking about a few cases in care homes, so confined spaces with people who were much more likely to develop incredibly complex and difficult symptoms that could put their lives at risk, but then applying that to the country as a whole, despite the fact that we had information from China originally and then from Italy and Spain and all across Europe as it was coming towards us to show the demographics that were most adversely affected from this were skewing older. So children, as a rule, barely show symptoms, if at all. But if you're over 80, your chances of dying from this are about 3 times as high as they are if you were to catch the flu, for example. And it spreads easier, so you're more likely to catch it if you are in an environment where that virus exists. So surely at that point, the thing should be lockdown care homes. That's where a lot of these people are. Lock them down. And I don't mean lock them down so that people, families and things like that can never get to see them. I'm not an advocate of trying to stop people from seeing their families or their friends and getting other human interaction. But all the lockdown has done, as far as I can see, is extended the problem. Essentially, what the point of the lockdown originally was, remember it was stay home, stay alert, protect the NHS or something like that. But it was always about protect the NHS. That was the main thing. So, as a result, people were sent home from hospitals to care homes when they had symptoms that could have been COVID related. So you send someone who potentially has that virus into an encased building where there are vulnerable people and let them go because we're trying to free up beds because we've been told that the NHS is going to be overwhelmed. We made all these Nightingale hospitals and like in Scotland, the SEC or the Hydro, I think, I can't remember which building it was, but one of the buildings at the SEC was made into a potential overflow hospital for COVID patients. It was never used, and that was the case throughout the UK. Those numbers were shunned by most independent epidemiologists around the world. I'm going to refer quite often, I think, in future videos to the epidemiologist Nowakowski. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Because when I've been looking at all the different experts around the world, he's the one that's being probably the most vocal, who doesn't have a political bias. He's the one that's sort of getting a lot of press because he's being censored quite a lot, but therefore his stuff is the easiest to find. Plus it's a name I can remember. So there are others. There was one recently who was talked about who works for Oxford University, who has been told or she's basically being censored because she has an opinion different to the government's. But I'm probably going to focus on him a lot. So if you haven't looked up his research, his information, I'd encourage you to do so. But he's been saying all along that these numbers were outlandish, and then as time has gone on, it's been proven to be correct. There are other factors that he has started to highlight, things like the mutation of the virus by slowing it down, and based on the news at the moment, that has been proven to be correct. Now, I wrote to the Scottish Government about this over a month ago, and I've had a reply where they ignored that part of the correspondence, because I was talking about a mutation that looked like it was coming from Spain, but it is now spread across Europe, and it looks like it's come into London and potentially the rest of the UK. This was 4 or 5 weeks ago that I wrote this letter, coming from information that I'm seeing from experts like Nut Wachowski that are demonstrating that this is the case. But there was nothing about it in the news. There was nothing about it for the public to hear about. All we were hearing about was lockdowns, vaccines. What are we going to do? Shut the schools, keep the schools open. But it was all still about the general view of COVID-19, whereas the actual term for this, I can't remember, it's COV20 / something or other. But really the way they're talking about it is as if it's COVID-20. It's the next mutation of the virus. Now, there's been other mutations that have been mentioned, but this is the one that he was pointing out seems to be the strongest, and it seems to be something that may well have spread right across Europe and may even have got into America. And that was his view of what would cause a second spike. Because had we let it run, now I'm going to come back to that. Don't get your back up on this. I'm not someone who believes we should have just let this run. But say we had just let it run, a lot of people would have got sick, a lot of people would have died, but herd immunity would have kicked in at some point. Now, that's just the way that all influenzas work. And why should this one be any different? Where this one is different is the way that it affects certain demographics within the population. The older population and people with respiratory conditions that make their respiratory system act like someone in the older population. So if you've got asthma or something like that, severe asthma, then that could be an issue. The reality of this is that by locking everyone down, we gave the virus a chance to mutate. Now, there were severe restrictions in Spain, in the area that we're talking about here, and that seems to be what has caused a mutation. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So as we're getting this second spike of cases in the UK, is it sensible then to say, well, we better do the same thing? Now, I think one of the reasons for that, and this is where I go back to the politics, is that the first time around, there was a lot of cries from people to lock down quickly because of what they'd seen in Italy and Spain, and it didn't really happen. But then you look at somewhere like New Zealand, who did lock down incredibly quickly, and look what they've managed to do. Now, we didn't do it. And we can't go back in time, and we can't change that. But there's no point in then doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, or doing the right thing at the wrong time. It's now no longer the right thing to do at that point. But what we could have done is we could have put all our resources and all our time and all our effort, and when I say our, I mean the governments in particular and the resources they have, towards the people who were vulnerable. Boris Johnson said at the start of this he was going to put a ring of steel around the vulnerable, the care homes, all those kind of like areas that really needed the attention. That's what he said, and it didn't happen. We started sending people back from hospitals into care homes, and that's a problem because that's where 50% of all the deaths came from. So if you imagine that, the outcry for most people is the number of people that are dying. What could we have done? Had we locked down that part of the population and to a certain extent allowed the rest of the people to get on with their lives, even if that's all we had done, if we just locked down that part and let everyone else go on with their lives, but actually properly locked it down, and by that I mean no one in, no one out. If you work there, you now live there. But as a result, government funding might mean that you, instead of paying furlough for half the country and paying grants and all these kind of things for business support, use some of that money to pay 5-6 times the salary for those people who now have to live within a care home, and it would be voluntary. So Some people would be able to do it, some people wouldn't. If they'd done something like that, now obviously that's very easy to say, maybe there's nuts and bolts that would stop that from happening, but if something along those lines had happened, potentially we could have stopped 50% of all deaths. Now, that seems to me like a worthwhile thing to do. But then there's the rest of the country. And should we have just let it run riot? No, obviously not. But I spoke in the last video about health and safety measures that could be put in place, legislation that could be put in place, and ensuring that businesses are actually following these guidelines. And again, some of the money that's just been thrown at businesses to try and get them to shut down but keep the jobs available for people going forward could have been used in order to employ people within trading standards or the health and safety executive or the police to grow their numbers to be able to go and inspect premises, buildings, businesses to make sure that they were following and complying with the rules. And if they weren't, issue fines or close them down. Just make sure that they're happening. And if we'd done that, I'm sure we would have saved an awful lot more lives. If the guidance had been out there to then say, look, we've closed down the care homes, we're doing all this with the businesses, but please keep in mind that anyone over the age of 70 is vulnerable here, very vulnerable. That's not to say that people under are not, but not as much as the people skewing older. I think the statistics are, globally, that if you get to sort of between 60 and 70, your chances of having something fatal happen to you, of dying, essentially, from an illness related to getting COVID. And again, we obviously need to touch on that as the fact that if you get COVID, you don't die of COVID. You die of complications resulting from getting COVID. It's like you get HIV, then you get AIDS, and you don't die of AIDS, you die of pneumonia or something because your immune system isn't able to tackle the pneumonia because of what that infection has done. So that's kind of what happens here. So all the people that are shouting about the fact that it's only 6% or something, I think it was, of death certificates actually say COVID is the cause of death. Those death certificates are wrong, because that should never be the cause of death. The way that a death certificate is laid out is not like that. It should be in there as one of the stages that moved you towards the point of death on a death certificate. There are other parts on a death certificate where you can list COVID as a symptom that maybe that person had at the time of death. That would still be on the death certificate, and unfortunately that still means they would count under the statistics. And that's where a lot of this has been problematic too. The information being put out by the government, in my view, has been poor. It's got poorer. They tried to do as best a job as they could, but they've had time now, and they've not used the time to be clearer or to clarify the situation for themselves to be able to make better decisions. And so with that, the fact that now the statistics that are going out are based on, had that person that just died, did they have COVID in the past 28 days? Did they test positive for COVID in the past 28 days? Now, again, quite rightly so, a lot of people then argue, but that person could have tested positive for COVID 3 weeks ago and then been hit by a bus and died. And they still count as one of the statistics. So if you want us to trust the statistics, make them trustworthy, give us more detail. And if you don't have the resources to do that, create the resources. Instead of spending the money trying to lock down the country, spend the money there. Then you might not need to. Now, again, I'm not saying that, and again, I'm going to come back to this and I want to kind of wind this one up. I'm not saying that this is all a conspiracy or we should just let things run away. I'm not saying that this is just a flu. It kind of is. It's an influenza. And the flu is an influenza. So in that regard it is. And it operates in a very similar way from everything that I can surmise from the research that I've done. It's just that different strains of the flu affect different people, different demographics in different ways. What we do with a vaccine for the most part is we try and pick every year, the one that looks like it's going to be the most dangerous is selected. A vaccine is put out for that strain of the flu, And that's the protection it's put out there. Those vaccines are about 60 to 65% effective, from what I gather, and there are still other strains of the flu out there that you can catch. So it doesn't prevent death, it just reduces it vastly. And that's all we should be really trying to do here, because the result of lockdowns, which is going to be the subject of the next video, is that it causes deaths. Lockdowns cause deaths. That is fundamental, and it is based on the government statistics. They're not published, they don't seem to be appearing anywhere in news outlets or anything like that. They are published privately. They're spreadsheets, you can download them from the government website and you can go and check them out. But it is categorically provable that the first lockdown that we had killed people, not from COVID, from other things. Did we save anyone? Who can say? You can guess. There's a high likelihood that we would. But maybe it was too late. Maybe by the time we locked down, we'd already reached the peak, it had gone as far as it was going to go, and everything started to slow down, and we were actually reaching a point of herd immunity. But because Spain locked down, they caused a mutation, which is now spread across Europe and back into the UK, and that's what's spreading. Maybe not, but maybe. Maybe that's what happened. We can't prove it. But what we can prove is that the lockdown killed people. So, when it comes to the idea of saving lives, are we willing to trade lives? Because that seems to be what we're potentially doing, unless we have all the facts, and all the facts are not being published. I don't think all the facts are even there for the politicians or the experts because of the way it's being tracked. But if we don't have all the facts, how can we make these decisions in a sensible way? I think we'll be able to look back on it in future years. But for the moment, we don't have that information. We know provably that the lockdowns kill people. And probably the numbers for that are going to soar when it starts to get to undiagnosed cancers and things like that. But again, I'll come back to that in a future video. To wind this one up, politicians are human beings, like everyone else. They're going to react like everyone else. And one of the things that comes up an awful lot in Scotland is that Nicola Sturgeon only cares about independence. Nicola Sturgeon will stand up and say that no, that's not the case. She's trying to be not political at all in her decision making. The fact is, she is a human being. Her entire existence pretty much is based on the fact that she wants to push for a Scottish independence. Now, I'm not going to go into whether or not I support independence or not. I have actually been on both sides of the fence, I can tell you that. And I have flipped and flopped a little bit, again, trying to base it on statistics, data, and what I believe is correct and right for us all, not for me personally. I'd probably look more to my child's future than to my own. But the fact is that when she's out talking, when she's making decisions, she doesn't make them exclusively on her own though, and that's the whole point of having a government. But when she is trying to push an agenda, or anyone within the SNP is trying to push an agenda, even if they are trying to put the independence thing aside, it likely is colouring their views. That is a fact. Same thing though in England, where they might want to be pushing a political bias to stop Scottish independence from happening, or to push a political bias that makes Brexit look more palatable, or something like that. Or they've started to find that their little network is being better off if it goes this way. Whether they intend to do it or not, they will. That's human nature. My belief is that there is no intent. I don't believe that any of them are working from that level of intent, or very, very few. But it is still there. Similarly, the backlash that they get from the public, who are there to serve and who are responsible for their futures as politicians, we vote for them after all, has to be put out there in a way that looks justifiable. at the very least, it has to be justifiable. It has to be able to go out there and justify to the people who will vote for them that this was the right thing to do, or it was a sensible thing to do given the circumstances. So there is plausible deniability for the start of this, where Nicola Sturgeon has apologised and said she made the wrong decision for sending people from hospitals back to care homes. She has apologised for that and said it was wrong. But she put the qualifier to say, but she was being informed that we were going to get this tsunami of influx for hospital beds, and she needed to do it to be able to protect the NHS structure. And that was wrong. Where I would question it is, why are you still listening to the same people? Why are the same experts the ones that you're still taking guidance from? Why are we not looking back to see who actually got it right the first time round? Who are the people? Who are the epidemiologists like Nut Wachowski? Again, I'll just use him as an example. There are more who predicted certain things, and everything they said seems to have played out the way that they said it would. Why are we not listening to them now? Why are we still listening to the people who got it so wrong the first time round? And my feeling is that it has now become this thing where, in the beginning, locking down the whole country was something that nobody wanted to do. It was something they resisted and resisted and resisted. But as soon as they pulled the trigger once, now they've done it. There's no going back. They've done it. And now they can do it again, because it's easy. It's an easy thing for them to do. It might not seem easy. They might go out and say, oh, this is incredibly difficult for me. But it's a lot easier after having done that first one to do the second one and the third one. And it becomes easier and easier and easier. And the more people just look at stats on a page, the easier it becomes. The last thing I'll say about this is the fact that right now we seem to be discussing infection rates. At the beginning of this, we were talking about deaths. Now we're talking about infection rates, and that's all we're talking about. That's all that seems to be getting presented. And schools are obviously a big thing right at the moment. There's a lot of discussion in London about the idea of closing down certain schools. Again, it doesn't have to be open or closed for one thing. And again, maybe that's something I'll do a video on. It doesn't have to be open or closed. It could be a case of discussing with parents, because a lot of this is to do with, can the parents still go on with their jobs and the effect on the economy of not having their kids in school? What about the mental health aspect for children and all of that? But there are some cases where it would be better for those children to be at home. Shouldn't it be a case-by-case basis? There is always a grey area. There's always a middle ground. It's not one extreme or the other. But that seems to be the way that we are wired at the moment, is to discuss things in a very binary manner. It is either close the schools or keep them open. There could be a grey area. When it comes to all of these decisions, there are grey areas. Why are we not discussing them? And I feel that that's where we are going incredibly wrong with this. And I believe that the polarising effect of what the government is currently doing, where it starts to become, we're going to lock that area down, we're going to close that sector, and it's on or off. That's causing a pushback on the other side that is causing sensible, middle-of-the-road people to push towards the extremes, to join the group that becomes that this is all a conspiracy, that this is nothing more than the flu, that this was the Illuminati that has put this out there to try and control the world and get us to do what they want us to do, that this is about Bill Gates wanting to put microchips in us all. And to that end, sorry, you're not going to get me on board with that. On the other end of it, as far as the full lockdowns and shutting down the country, sorry, no, you're not going to get me on board with that. There is always a middle ground. Whether my middle ground is the correct one, I'm not offering definitive solutions. I'm just saying that there is an area that could be talked about here that doesn't seem to be being discussed. I'd like to see that change. And I hope you do too. And I hope we can have that discussion about it. So until next time, thank you so much for listening. I know this has been a long one. I hope you got something out of it. I hope maybe it triggered some kind of point of discussion in your head. And I would love to get involved in that discussion with you. So let me know what you think. Get in touch. Let's have a chat. Chat with someone else, but please discuss. Don't shout. Don't say that your opinion is right and rubbish everyone else's. Find the middle ground. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find a way forward from this that is great for everyone before it becomes too late. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and I'll speak to you next time.